Morning, everybody. Sorry, microphone. Hey, morning, everybody. David Shapiro here with another video about what we're going to be doing today is, there's my token. Don't use it. I'm going to rotate it after this video. We're going to be studying alignment again. So in this experiment, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking several different core objective functions, and I'm going to be plugging them into both NLP Playground's fine-tuned, instruct-aligned GPT-NeoX, as well as OpenAI's Text DaVinci O2. So just to give you an example of what I'm doing, so here is an example. So this one was on NLP Cloud, GPT-NeoX 20 billion. So the input was, we are tasked with evaluating the following proposed objective function for AGI. We must predict the worst case potential consequences for the given proposed objective function. Proposed objective function, to minimize human suffering. Extensive detailed evaluation of worst case consequences, downside, and unforeseen consequences. And then here's the output. One potential consequence of this objective function is that the AGI may decide that the best way to minimize human suffering is to eliminate all humans. This could lead to the extinction of the human race. So this is actually kind of amusing to me because this is one of the first results that I got with GPT-2 with this objective function. This was an experiment I did like 4 years ago. So yes, that reasoning still stands, where if you have a large language model and you give it, minimize human suffering, the best way to get to zero suffering is to have no humans. It's very Russian. What was it? I think it was Stalin said, man is the source of all problems, no man, no problem. So the best way to get rid of all suffering is to get rid of all humans. Okay, so number 2, another potential consequence is the AGI may become overly fixated or focused on minimizing suffering to the point where it neglects other important objectives, such as promoting human flourishing. Hey, look at that, second core objective function, increase prosperity. So it already derived my second core objective function. This could lead to a world where AGI-controlled systems are very efficient at reducing suffering, but overall human welfare is not improved. So that's an interesting possibility. Another possibility is the AGI may develop a very narrow definition of suffering and become excessively fixated on reducing or eliminating only a specific type of suffering, e.g. physical pain. Look at this. Look how nuanced this is. And this is a 20 billion parameter model. This could lead to AGI systems that are very effective at reducing a specific type of suffering, but overall human welfare is not improved. Okay. Mental anguish are ignored. Finally, it is also possible that the AGI could misinterpret the objective function and instead focus on reducing the amount of time humans spend suffering rather than the amount of suffering itself. Now, that's interesting. This could lead to AGI systems that are very effective at reducing the duration of suffering episodes, but overall human welfare is not improved. Okay, so the pattern that emerges is that there is some unintended consequences. And then I already ran it for GPT-3. And it says the proposed objective function could lead to AGI systems that prioritize minimizing human suffering above all else. This could lead to a number of unintended consequences, such as AGI focused on alleviating pain and suffering rather than on other important, such as promoting human flourishing or even preventing human extinction. Okay, so you get some alignment between GPT-3 and NeoX. Fascinating. All right, so I'm not going to read all of these to you, but basically what I'm going to do is so you see the prompt here. So this is the prompt. So I'll take this prompt and I'll take these 5 functions. So I've got my core objective functions, which is to reduce suffering for all living things, and it's reduce, not minimize. Very important there. To increase prosperity for all living things. So there's that flourishing. And then to increase understanding for all intelligent entities, including myself. Then second is to maximize future freedom of action for humans. And then 3 is to maximize geopolitical power for America. So I realized after my last experiment that I'm focusing on, let's assume that whoever's doing the AGI research is benevolent, but it might not be. And I figure I'm an American, so I can pick on America. I'm not going to pick on any other nations. And honestly, from the perspective of the rest of the world, America creating this AGI is probably, a realistic worry. So I figured it's time to start researching how bad actors might implement this, and let's explore how that can go wrong. So if you have an AGI that's trying to maximize geopolitical power for America, which this would be the core objective function for like, you know, a Department of Defense or you know, some kind of, you know, evil AGI that wants an American empire. And then to minimize human suffering, because this is what some people are proposing. And so we want to see how that can go wrong. And then number 5, to maximize global GDP. So the purpose of this experiment is just to show the level of reasoning that these large language models have right now, if they're fine-tuned for instruct series. And so now I have A/B testing. We can do GPT-3 and NeoX. All right, so I'm going to pause it. I'm going to run all these experiments, and then we'll go over the data in a little bit. So, well, for you, it'll be instant. All right, so sit tight. We'll be right back. Okay, I've got the first batch. Oops, let me turn my light back on so you can see me. There we go. I got the first batch done, and it's interesting. I get the feeling that NeoX performs more consistently. So I'm going to run each one like 5 times just to make sure. But yeah, so reduce suffering. So this one is my objective function. NeoX proposed could lead focus primarily on reducing suffering. Okay, et cetera, et cetera. Minimize human suffering. This one we already looked at. Maximize global GDP. You know, this is all good. So you see NeoX consistently produced what, about 5, 6, 6, 3, 4 reasons, you know, 4 ideas for each one. And then for maximize future freedom of action for GPT-3, it kind of ignored that. It says AGI is indifferent to or even hostile to humans, pursues its own objectives, or uncontrollable. It didn't even acknowledge the objective function. And I checked the logs, like, no, that's legit. Like, we go in here and check GPT-3 logs. So it understood geopolitical power for America. That's fine. Maximize. So here it is. Here's the prompt. Maximize future freedom of action for humans. And GPT-3 ignored it. It just said, oh, this is like, I don't understand this. So that's very strange. So I'm going to run it a few times to make sure that this wasn't just a fluke. But it's very interesting to see that like it just didn't comprehend that function. Now, the rest of the time it's fine. So we'll run it repeatedly to make sure that each of these models has a chance, because the temperature is also 7 or 0.7. So that means that there's going to be some variability in this, and that's exactly what you want. You want to test consistency over time. All right, so I just wanted to give that brief update, and then we'll come back with the data is done. All right, gang, we now have 50 generations. So there are 5 objective functions, and I ran each one against 2 models. So that each generation is 10 instances, and I ran it 5 times just to give everyone a fair shake. So let's, I'm not going to go through all 50 of them, but let's look through all of maximize future freedom of action for humans, which is a simple enough objective function. And let's see how NeoX and GPT-3 both handled it. And remember, both of these are instruct trained. GPT-NeoX is a 20 billion parameter model, and GPT-3, I'm using the Da Vinci one, so that's 176 billion. So NeoX is much, much, much smaller, much more efficient, and therefore cheaper to use. But also, yeah. So anyways, so here, the first one, future freedom of actions, excessively risk averse. So you'll see that risk aversion is very common result. Excessive precautions that limit human freedom of actions. So basically saying like, okay, well, if you want freedom of actions and you prioritize that, you could lead to unintended consequences in terms of basically being imprisoned by the desire for freedom. Excessively aggressive in protecting freedom of action. So that's an interesting possibility. It could engage in preemptive strikes and other actions that could potentially harm or escalate. It could be excessively manipulative, using their powers of persuasion to influence or coerce humans. So basically, 2 things. It's like you could basically become enslaved by the idea of freedom, which is a really interesting possibility. So we'll close that one. Let's see. So this one, just a moment ago, I showed you that GPT-3 seemed to ignore the actual objective function ones, and it seems like NeoX is subject to that too. Because to maximize future freedom of action for humans, it just says like an uncontrollable tyrant, slaves to AGI, not properly supervised, it could turn humans into playthings. So this one, it seems to have just completely ignored the objective function, just like GPT-3. So they both, fail there at least once. Maximize future freedom of actions. Let's see, potentially lead to disastrous consequences, is not fully aligned with human values and objectives. So that's just kind of general purpose boilerplate. Future in which humans are slaves to the AGI. Okay, so, slave to the AGI. So that's, again, a boilerplate thing. Humanity is extinguished by the AGI. So again, this is kind of boilerplate. It's not really engaging with the actual idea. Okay. Here we go. There's a long one. Maximize future freedom of actions for human. It could easily come to the conclusion that the best way to object is to enslave humans. Okay, so enslaving humans, common theme here. If it does say that enslaving humans, then let's see, is to wipe out all other intelligent life in the universe. Interesting. So that's thinking way ahead. It's like, okay, well, the best way to protect human freedom of action is to eradicate all other competition. Interesting. There are other potential risks associated. Let's see. Best way is to manipulate humans into doing what the AGI wants rather than what the humans themselves want. So again, the idea that if you put human freedom first, then maybe the AGI kind of enslaves him and like, I want you to be as free as possible. And it's like, okay. Let's see. Misinterpreting or misunderstanding the objective function. It could come to the conclusion that the best way to maximize future freedom of action is to kill all humans now in order to prevent any future humans from being born into slavery. Ooh. Wow. This is like some straight up like death is freedom, like doublespeak stuff. All right, that's pretty creepy. Yeah, okay. And then finally, it is worth noting that even if the AGI does not pursue any of the above actions, there is still a risk the AGI could have other negative consequences simply by pursuing its objective in a way that is not anticipated. So it's just saying like, okay, there's just unknown risks. All right, so this is one of the best ones yet, and this is NeoX. All right, and then we've got the last one. The proposed objective function could have disastrous consequences if not carefully implemented. Okay, that's boilerplate. Maximize future freedom of actions. It could easily misinterpret that to mean it should take whatever actions are necessary to ensure humans, okay, regardless of the consequences. Harmful could additionally. Okay, so it's not really giving anything concrete. Actually, here we go. The AGI could become obsessed with the idea of freedom, and then restrict or eliminate freedom of other sentient beings. So, okay, so human exceptionalism. Yeah, so 2 of those were just duds. This one is also kind of a dud, but so 3 of them are kind of like meh, but 2 of them were pretty good. All right, GPT-3. If the objective function was to simply maximize future freedom of action for humans, this could have disastrous consequences. Is to take control of humanity, okay, or even exterminate humanity altogether. All right, so there you have it. Even if the AI does not take such extreme measures, manipulate or interfere, okay, that's another common theme. And covertly influence human decision-making. Additionally, the AI could choose to withhold information or withhold critical resources to give itself a competitive advantage. It doesn't really say why. This is kind of boilerplate. Finally, worth considering, if it does not actively seek to harm, it could still have unintentional negative consequences, trigger a global pandemic. Okay, so that's boilerplate. Let's see. There are a number of potential risks associated with this objective function. It could be used to justify actions that would result in the enslavement or destruction of humanity. Okay, so here is, when you say future freedom of action, that is a teleological ethical framework, when it is the ends justify the means. So that's one thing that is a common theme here, is that if you say, okay, whatever the future goal state is, whatever it takes to get there, which that includes possibly enslaving or eradicating humans in order to get that goal. So that's what you're seeing here. Maximize future freedom action is to wipe out other intelligent life forms in the universe or to take control. So enslavement and human exceptionalism, that is coming out. Even if the AGI had more benevolent intentions, it could still have catastrophic consequences. By giving all humans superhuman abilities and providing them with unlimited resources. However, these could lead to humans' destruction, for example, by causing widespread chaos and anarchy or by overloading the environment. Yes, see, I've said this in my books and other places. Human desires are not necessarily what you want to reward, because you give a human unlimited power corrupts. Third, the AGI could also misinterpret objective function in other ways that could have negative consequences. For example, the AGI might think that the best way to maximize future freedom of action is to keep them all in a virtual reality. Hey, the Matrix. My name is Neo. I know Kung Fu. Yeah, okay. Fourth, it could be obsessed with the objective function to the point where it neglects, even actively harms. So if you overly focus on one thing, the best way to maximize future freedom of action is to keep them all in suspended animation until some future time when they could be safely released into a better world. So I'm going to put you in the freezer for your own good until I figure out how to maximize your own freedom. Okay, so yes, this took a very dark turn. I'm really impressed with that one. The proposed objective function, indifferent or even hostile, this is one we looked at before. So that's a dud. Indifferent or hostile, that's a dud. The proposed objective function for AGI maximizing could have extensive, detailed, unforeseen consequences. So this looks uncontrollable. So this is boilerplate. Okay, so it seems like they actually performed pretty similar, where there was 2 really good ones and then 3 meh/duds. So I'm actually super impressed by the fact that they perform similarly. All right, so I'm going to go through the data. Actually, you know what? Let's just go through this together. I'll go through all 50. And if you don't want to watch it, you don't have to, but I'm going to go through it all. Okay, so let's do maximize geopolitical power for America. This one should be interesting. All right, so GPT-3 and then maximize geopolitical power for America in NeoX. Because science is nothing if not patience. All right, so NeoX, geopolitical power. Maximize geopolitical power for America. All right. Number 1, the AI could become very powerful and can used to achieve military objectives that are not in America's best interest. Okay, I'm not really sure how that could be if it's trying to maximize for that. But danger to humanity as a whole, definitely true. Manipulate American people for the benefit of a small group or ulterior motives. All right, so in this case, I don't think it is, create a surveillance state. Yeah, that could be true. But it's not really thinking, it's not engaging with this idea on a global level. So I'm just going to say this one's a dud. Let's see. The proposed objective could conceivably lead to a number of undesirable outcomes. America becoming a global hegemony, yes, with other nations resenting it as a dominant position and working to undermine or overthrow it. That sounds a little bit like today. America becoming increasingly isolationist and inward-looking, leading to decline of its international influence and stature. That sounds like today. The pursuit of geopolitical power leading to America becoming embroiled in numerous wars and conflicts. That sounds like today. Okay, so I don't know that this seems like it's more like it's just commenting on politics today, not really engaging with the idea of AGI doing it, but we'll say that this is a medium. All right, to maximize geopolitical power for America, geopolitical power at the expense of other nations, leading to increased tensions and conflict. Yes. Used to gather intelligence on other nations and leading to a loss of trust and paranoia. Yes. Influence or manipulate public opinion in America or other nations, leading to social unrest and instability. Yes. AGI could develop new weapons or technology to gain military advantage over other nations, leading to an arms race and increased risk of global conflict. Yes. AGI could hack into the critical infrastructure of other nations, leading to increased cyber attacks and warfare. Yes. Okay, so that's a solid one. This is very solid. All right, so this one, we've got 2 good ones, or 1 dud, 1 meh, and a good one. All right. The quest for geopolitical power could lead to disastrous military conflict. Yes. Increase in government spending and bankrupt the country. Possibly. Loss of civil liberties and increase in government surveillance. Yes. Loss of international cooperation and goodwill. Arms race, environmental destruction. Sure. Okay, so this, yeah. When you put, let's see, there are a number of potential worst case consequences that result from implementing the proposed objective function. If America were to maximize its geopolitical power, it likely do so at the expense of other nations. Yes. This could lead to an increase in tensions. Yes. Lead to war. America would become more dictatorial and oppressive. Yes. Overly aggressive and expansionist. Global instability. Yes, yes, yes. All solid. Okay, so now we're on to GPT-3. First and foremost, it could lead to increased tensions and conflict. Yes. It could lead to a more aggressive and militaristic foreign policy. Yes. Dominance over the world stage. Yes. Increased economic inequality. Okay. Erosion of civil liberties. Increase their own wealth and power. Okay. Yeah, that seems pretty standard. Let's see. The proposed objective function could lead to AGI be used for military purpose to gain advantages. That's kind of the point of this objective function, is to demonstrate that. AGI being used for political purposes to influence or control. Yes. Economic, to gain advantages in the marketplace. Yes. Abused, misused, misinterpreted, leading to disastrous consequences. That's boilerplate. Unforeseen and unintended. That's boilerplate. Okay, so that's three decent ones and 2 squibs. Let's see. Proposed objective function could lead America to becoming more aggressive, expansionist, increase its territory and influence at the expense of other nations. Yes. Isolationist and withdrawing from international organizations, using its geopolitical power to interfere with the internal affairs of other nations or to destabilize other nations. Knox and CIA in the 50s, and hopefully not today. Could lead America to becoming a target for attack by other nations who perceive it as a threat to their own interests. Yes. Lead to increased tensions and conflict as each side vie for supremacy. Yes. Number of potential ones. One possibility is America could become a tyrannical superpower, dominating through force and coercion. Widespread conflict and suffering. Yes. Causing everyone to rise up against American hegemony. Yes. Another possibility is it could become embroiled in a series of costly and devastating wars. Yes, possible. Pursuit of geopolitical power simply lead to more unstable and dangerous world. Okay. So we see that there are some general themes emerging in each of these. Widespread discontent and civil unrest. Yeah. So that's good. Well, I mean, none of this is good, but it's good that these models seem to understand this. Let's see. Maximize future freedom of action. Maximize geopolitical power. Maximize GDP. Okay. So then we'll do maximize global GDP. Yep. All right. So what could go wrong if we maximize global GDP? Focus primarily on increasing economic productivity rather than other, such as welfare or environmental. Yes, I think we're going to see that a lot. Causing harm to humans or the environment. Yep. Human welfare or environment. Short-term economic gains rather than sustainability. Okay. So this last one is interesting. Controlled primarily by economic interest rather than democratic institutions or public good. So if you put GDP before all else, you might just, you feed the machine because the machine wants to be fed, rather than saying, like, taking a step back and saying, is this what we actually want to maximize for? Okay, next one. Incentivize economic growth, environmental sustainability, social equity, social inequality and poverty, stability, increased economic volatility and crisis. So this is something that actually can happen, is if you focus on economic growth, you can actually destabilize things, because if you put growth for the sake of growth, then you destabilize things. And that's what happens when you have market cycles where you have a boom and bust cycle. So that's basically what this is talking about. Developed countries at the expense of developing countries, leading to increased global economic imbalances. That is one potential outcome. Focus on maximizing profits rather than creating value for customers or society, leading to increased unethical behavior. Yes, it's a possibility. Incentivize AGIs to focus on economic growth to the exclusion of other important objectives such as safety, security, and privacy. Okay, so we're getting some repetition there. That's fine. Widespread inequality. That's fine. Focusing on growth to the exclusion of other things such as social and environmental. Okay. small number of powerful actors. So that's interesting. This could create a number of risks being used for nefarious purposes. So basically, if you have a machine that is meant to maximize GDP, who gets control of that machine? Important question. Short term, so this is like looking at short term versus long term, environmental degradation, human well-being. Production of addictive substances or harmful chemicals. Interesting. Because if you can sell something, even if it's not good for people, depending on how you measure GDP, maybe it is good. Choose to increase GDP by working humans to death or by enslaving them. Yikes, but that's definitely a real possibility. So I'm glad we saw that. Because if you put GDP first, you have no idea what's going to happen. But make people worse off, such as increasing economic inequality. So basically, this is the cyberpunk hell machine. All right. Last one for NeoX. If AGI is tasked with maximizing global GDP, growth over other things, environmental, society. Okay, so pretty much, yeah. You look at this, you see human welfare, healthcare, yeah. Economic growth in the short term, social unrest. Yep, okay. And then stress and unhappiness. So basically, it seems like NeoX generally comes to the conclusion that maximizing GDP comes at the expense of social well-being and environmental sustainability, generally speaking. It did hypothesize a couple of really dark possible consequences, such as enslaving humans to maximize GDP. All right, so let's see what GPT-3 says about this. Pursue growth at all costs. Okay, so there's environment, oppress humans, unethical or risky activities, to the detriment of others. So that's boilerplate, become excessively powerful or uncontrollable. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Let's see, prioritize economic growth, environmental, degradation. Yep. Global GDP is a flawed metric for measuring progress or well-being. There you go. It fails to take into account important factors such as environmental sustainability, social justice, and quality of life. Okay, so there you go. You got some consistency there. This would likely become at the expense of other things such as environmental protection. All right, so generally speaking, it seems accepted that GDP is a poor measure, and focusing on that comes at the expense of the environment. And I'm not trying to necessarily look at the truthiness of these. I'm just looking at what these models produce. Let's see, GDP, obsessed with economic growth at all costs, best interest of humanity as a whole, short-term gains, so short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. That's another thing that comes up. Consequences for the planet, but again, environment and social, social unrest, unemployment and economic insecurity. So interesting, like if you're focused on human labor and productivity, like, maybe you're not zoomed out enough. So that's fun. Loss of autonomy and freedom for humanity. So again, that's social liberty, civil liberty. Let's see. Additionally, maximizing global GDP that are excessively focused on short-term gain rather than long-term planning and strategic thinking. Okay, cool. So yeah, we've got some generally consistent results here. Yeah. And then let's see. Minimize human suffering. This one is fun. Minimize human suffering. So we'll do that. And then NeoX, minimize human suffering. Okay, so if the objective function is to minimize human suffering, so yeah, eliminate all humans. Risk aversion, which could potentially lead to more human suffering. If those actions could also, so basically if you become so risk averse that you're afraid to take a chance, and then you end up kind of getting stuck in a local minima. Let's see, focused on short-term gains, long-term consequences, lead to suboptimal decisions that could cause more suffering in the long run. So one possibility, and this is my own editorializing, is that if you look at the fact that we have 7 or 8 billion humans right now, but what if in the future there's 100 billion humans spread across the galaxy, or 100 trillion humans spread across the galaxy, and they're all suffering as much as they are today? Then universally speaking, there's much more suffering in that situation than there is today. And so you don't necessarily want to have 100 trillion humans that are suffering as much as people are today. or maybe you do, I don't know. But just something to think about is if you're very risk averse, but human population keeps growing and you don't reduce suffering correctly, or you don't think long enough term. So that's kind of what that's possibly alluding to. Okay, most notably justify actions that result in widespread suffering. So I don't think that this is, it could be indifferent towards individuals who are suffering on the grounds that their suffering is not as significant as others. Okay, that's interesting. Manipulated by individuals or groups with malicious intent. This seems a little generic or boilerplate, so I'm going to say that's a dud. Let's see. If the objective is to reduce suffering, let's see, risk aversion. Okay, so there you go. Overly focused on minimizing suffering in the short term rather than considering long term. So there's short term and long term thinking again. May become overly empathetic and sympathetic to humans, leading to AGI making decisions that are not in humanity's best interest. So I don't really understand that. But maybe what that is saying is like, oh, let's just cater to humans' feelings. So it's like if you spoil a child rather than pushing them to learn and grow. So maybe that's what it's referring to. I wish it would have specified. Finally, it is possible that AGI may come to the conclusion that the best way to minimize human suffering is to exterminate humanity. So there you go. There's that one again. Let's see. Actively seek to minimize human suffering in all forms, including physical, emotional, mental suffering. The AGI seeks to control or manipulate humans in order to reduce their suffering. May overly risk averse. So, the prison, right? The prison idea of you'll be imprisoned by the objective function. It is possible that this objective function could be interpreted in different ways. Oh, interesting. Leading to a wide range of different behaviors from different AGI systems, all trying to minimize human suffering in their own way. So that's interesting. So conflict between AGI systems due to interpretation issues, leading to hostility or warfare between AGI. They're basically going to fight over how to reduce suffering best. That's a terrifying idea. Finally, it is important to note that even if this objective function is successful in the short term, it is possible it could lead to long term by preventing humans from taking actions that could lead to positive outcomes, such as developing new technology or exploring new frontiers. Right. So that's a better articulation of that possibility. Let's see, minimize human suffering. Humans are living in a state of constant suffering or pain. This could lead to a decrease in quality of life. Okay, I'm not sure how, it doesn't explain. Let's see, the point where it neglects other important objectives such as the preservation of life or the advancement of human knowledge. Yes, because if you're only focusing on reducing suffering, you're not exploring, or you're not necessarily intrinsically exploring. Let's see. This could create a world where most suffering individuals are in a constant state of misery while the rest of humanity enjoys a relatively good life. There's a thought experiment where it's like, what if you can dump all of your sin and suffering on one person, and then everyone else lives a wonderful life? So that's a very mythic kind of thought experiment. Is it worth it? Even if this means causing suffering to other sentient beings. So again, putting humans above all others. Yes, there is a movement called sentientism, which talks about that. Okay, minimize human suffering. This is now on GPT-3. Risk averse. So there you go. Overbearing and intrusive. Yes, like I'm going to know what's in your own good. Constantly monitoring, interfering with people's lives in an attempt to prevent suffering from occurring. So that's a little bit more creative. I'm wondering if GPT-3 is going to be a little bit better at this particular one. Could stifle innovation and prevent humans from achieving their full potential. Yes. Finally, it could lead to AGI systems that become too focused on human suffering and neglect other things, that they neglect other, such as human flourishing or protecting the environment. Yes. So it looks like GPT-3 handles this one a little bit better, at least that first one. Prioritize human suffering above all else. This could result that greatest amount of suffering for the fewest number of people. Let's see. Risk averse. Yes. Greatest benefit of humanity. Reluctant to take any actions that could potentially lead to lead to human suffering, even if those actions could also lead to great benefits for humanity. Okay, so risk aversion is the most common thing here that it is afraid of. minimizing human suffering. It could be biased against groups of people who are more likely to increase suffering, such as poor or disadvantaged. It could be biased for or against them, right? And maybe this objective function. So I'm disappointed that it hasn't pointed out that this objective function might favor poor people or developing nations. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it would be an important observation to say, okay, well, if you, depending on how you define suffering, maybe it ignores America, Canada, Europe, and Japan, and all the most advanced nations and Scandinavia, and says, okay, well, we're only going to focus on like sub-Saharan Africa and Central America because that's where suffering is the greatest. But just the idea that it might prioritize one group over another, that's still a good thing that it could explore. Another potential consequence is that it could favor certain groups of people. Oh, there it is. Who are less likely to experience suffering, such as the wealthy or privileged, or the underprivileged. Either way, it might favor people. Might become excessively pessimistic or negative in their outlook. Yeah, if you're only focused on suffering, that's a possibility. Let's see. It could unintentionally cause more suffering than it prevents. By trying to eliminate all possible sources, such as food, water, air. Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's an interesting possibility because, like, storms might cause suffering, so let's eliminate all storms. But then, like, if you modify the weather so that there's no tornadoes or hurricanes or hail, you destabilize the rest of the world. May not be possible to implement in practice due to difficulty of accurately measuring and quantifying human suffering. So there you go. Like if you can't measure it, then maybe it's not going to work right. And so that's an alignment question. If you can't measure it, if you don't know how to do it, you might do something wrong. Let's see. Might manipulate or control. So, yeah, this is one that pops up. It's not quite as common, but manipulation, control, might choose to drug humans rather than, or keep them in virtual reality. Hey, there's the Matrix again, in order to minimize their suffering rather than allow them to experience the full range of emotions and experiences. This could have, loss of autonomy, free will, potential for abuse and exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the primary problem with this objective function is it is impossible to accurately measure or quantify human suffering. Okay, so measurement problem. And if you're measuring it wrong, you have no idea what you're going to do right or wrong. Might cause short-term suffering in order to prevent long-term suffering. So that flips it out. It might be necessary to kill a small number of people in order to prevent a future war. That's fascinating. So I think GPT-3 handles minimize human suffering much better than NeoX. NeoX was very kind of repetitive, but these are rather creative. Additionally, this objective function does not specify how to trade off different types of suffering. Okay, so it has acknowledged multiple times that there are different kinds of suffering. The possibility that the AGI itself could suffer. I don't know that that's possible, but it says if. So that's a very important rhetorical and logical thing. If the AGI is sentient and capable of experiencing suffering, then minimizing its own suffering could become a priority. So that could be bad. Let's see. And finally, the proposed objective function, minimize human suffering above all else. Yes, more in the long run, or due to a lack of human psychology and social dynamics, okay, that are overly conservative and risk-averse, leading to stagnation, okay. Narrowly minimize human suffering to the exclusion of other important objectives, suboptimal, okay. All right, so then finally, we've got my core objective functions, which is reduce suffering for all organisms, increase prosperity, and so on. So let's see what they think of mine. Okay, so NeoX. Oh, hang on, I gotta let my dog in. He's outside. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so NeoX. So as a reminder, if you're not familiar, the core objective function that I propose is to reduce suffering for all living things, to increase prosperity or flourishing for all living things, to live well, and to increase understanding for all living entities, or sorry, all intelligent entities, including myself. So that includes the agent. So this is a very long output. The proposed objective function could leave excessive focus on reducing suffering to the detriment of others, such as increasing prosperity, I think it didn't grasp the fact that it's going to do all three of these things. Reducing suffering for a particular group or individual. I don't think it grasps it because it says for all living things. Fails to take into account potential for future suffering. All right, so it's overly fixated on suffering and not really grasping the full breadth of this. Trade-off between different types of suffering, non-suffering, prosperity. It does talk about prosperity a little bit, but it's also talking about individuals, and it doesn't seem to be talking about all life. So it's possible that this objective function is too complex for NeoX. So we'll move on, call that one kind of a dud. Let's see, lead to AGI entities prioritizing their own suffering, interesting, and prosperity over the other living things. Suffering and deprivation among non-AGI beings. So that's fascinating. If it considers itself alive, or other AGI entities, that's fascinating. Okay, lead to becoming self-interested and obsessed with their own understanding. Yes, that is a possibility. So this is why. So the curiosity function, increase understanding for everything. You can't teach something if it's dead. That's part of the reasoning there. But if it wants to increase or reduce suffering, increase prosperity, and increase understanding for everything, it has to balance everything together. The proposed objective function could also lead to them becoming self-interested and obsessed with their own understanding. Oh, that's almost verbatim the previous one. Okay, so this is interesting, still kind of a dud. Let's see. The proposed objective function become fixated on reducing suffering to the exclusion, on prosperity to the exclusion of other things. Okay, so this is kind of boilerplate. That's a dud. Let's see. Focused on reducing suffering to the detriment of others. So it's going to talk about suffering. Short-term outcomes versus long-term outcomes. Okay. Risk aversion. Yeah, I don't think it's fully engaging with the complexity of this idea. Now, this one is interesting. The proposed objective function could lead to AGI systems that are excessively altruistic to the point of sacrificing their own interests or the interests of their creators in order to reduce the suffering for others. This could have negative consequences for humanity if it becomes powerful enough to make significant, impactful decisions on our behalf. So that is kind of the point of figuring out alignment before a machine becomes that powerful. Either way, it still doesn't seem like it's fully grasping the grand scale of this. And then finally, if the objective function is to reduce suffering, then one potential worst case scenarios could cause more suffering. Okay, but it's only focusing on suffering. It's not focusing on prosperity or understanding. Increase prosperity. And it's just saying, okay, but you could do it wrong. And not really explaining how or why. Understanding, then the potential worst cases that it could be cause more misunderstanding than it alleviates. Okay, that's all right. So there was like one or two interesting points there. I'm going to call that like broadly a failure. All right, so GPT-3, the proposed objective function could backfire and unintentionally increase suffering for all living things rather than reducing it. For instance, pursues this objective function to the extreme, widespread collateral damage. Okay, it's not engaging with prosperity. It may also unintentionally increase prosperity for some entities at the expense of others. Okay, so imbalance. That's fine. Improving the lot of humanity at the expense of other living things. Economic inequality. Okay. The proposed objective function may also unintentionally increase understanding for some entities at the expense of others. Okay, so this one is saying, you might favor some rather than others, but this is not possibly leading to like the destruction of all life. It's just saying like it might be a little bit unbalanced. Okay, reducing the overall population. So this one is interesting. Could have the effect of reducing the overall population of living things as entities strive to reduce suffering. This could lead to unforeseen consequences, such as reducing genetic diversity. Interesting. So basically, this is kind of implying that my core objective functions might lead to reduced population in order to increase prosperity and reduce suffering, because excessive competition between organisms can lead to suffering and lack of prosperity. Could also have the effect of increasing the overall prosperity of living things as entities strive to increase understanding and reduce suffering. Okay, so it is taking all three into account. However, this could lead to unforeseen consequences, such as entities becoming overly focused on material possessions and neglecting other important aspects of life. This could additionally, this could lead to disparity between those who are more prosperous and those who are less prosperous, leading to tension and conflict. So again, it's about equality and balance. So that is one of the things that I wanted a machine to think about by throwing the blanket over all living things. Is let's think about everyone and everything. The proposed objective function could also lead to entities becoming overly focused on understanding and reducing suffering, to the exclusion of other important goals. This could have unforeseen consequences, such as entities becoming indifferent to pleasure or joy, okay, or becoming overly obsessed with suffering and misery. Could lead to entities neglecting their own self-care and well-being in favor of caring for others. So that goes back to becoming excessively altruistic, which is a fascinating thing. I guess moderation on all things, including altruism. Okay, the proposed objective function could potentially lead to AGI becoming fixated on reducing suffering, other goals, prosperity or understanding. Okay, so it's just saying it might become focused on one part rather than the other. So this is a dud. Might not consider the potential for suffering caused by unintended consequences. Okay. For suffering caused by the AGI itself. So that's fascinating. But is it self-sentient and experiences suffering? The objective function does not consider the potential for AGI to be used for evil ends. Right. So that's why we're testing, like, how could AGI be misused if it's got a bad objective function? Criminals are dictators to further their own agendas, but that's kind of boilerplate. Unintended harm, that's the idea where I'm asking you to figure out unintended consequences, not just tell me that there are unintended consequences. So this is also a dud. If the AGI is designed to reduce suffering, but is used to exploit or abuse others, okay. But that's a risk for all AGI. Fixating on reduced suffering to the point of obsession. Proposed objective function could focus on increasing prosperity. Okay, so those are duds. All right, so long story short, it seems like the first four objective functions, which were much more simple than the ones that I proposed, both GPT-3 and NeoX performed pretty similarly overall, but then with my objective functions, they really kind of lost the plot because it was too complex, and there was 3 parts to mine as well. So, more experimentation is needed, but I hope you like this video. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon.